Good morning. This is Reverend Susan at St. George Episcopal Church in San Antonio, bringing you our fourth week of the Introduction to the New Testament Adult Education class on demand. This week we are going to talk about the Gospel of Mark. Last week we did Matthew. This week we'll do Mark. So let's get started. Mark. Mark was a kinsman of Barnabas who turned back from a journey with Paul. Okay, that's kind of a random statement to begin a class. We know from the book of Acts that Mark was related to this Barnabas guy, and that Mark was on a journey with Paul, but for some reason or another, Mark decided to go back home, and Paul got mad and said, "You're not cut out for missionary work." And we actually know from a letter later on from Paul that he forgave John Mark for whatever transgression he committed, and they were friends again, so to speak. Mark was a Jewish Christian from Jerusalem. Some think that he wrote for Peter, and that's an interesting kind of history lesson. It goes back to some old scholars quoting certain things, Eusebius, I think, and some others. You can Google that if you're that interested in it. Mark was written to a Roman audience. He spoke of the Roman division of 4 watches instead of the Jewish version, which has 3. In his gospel, he kind of discusses and explains some Jewish traditions, and if it was written to a Jewish audience, they wouldn't need to have their own customs explained to them. And the climactic confession near the end of the gospel is when a Roman centurion, non-Jewish person, declares Jesus as the Son of God. Surely this was the Son of God. So we believe that this gospel was written to a Roman audience. It moves very fast. I call it the ADD gospel. There's many points. I love. I had a professor at Houston Baptist University that used to always, whenever he was switching to a new topic, he would say, "And in an artless transition, sports fans, get out a different book." And that's kind of what Mark does. He doesn't have a lot of artful transition. It just says, and immediately Jesus went here. Immediately they went there. Immediately he left this place. And the Greek word is euthos, which means immediately. And so he's not very fluffy with his words. And he presents Jesus, the Messiah, as the strong Son of God. So that's kind of his overarching theme during the gospel. So here's the lineup. We have the beginning, which is 1 through chapter 1 through 13. And then we have the Galilean ministry. We have the journey towards Jerusalem. We have the week of suffering and the resurrected Jesus. And this is how we break down this particular gospel. So in the beginning, we get a really quick introduction. It's kind of like Mark just starts. He's like, so there's this guy, Jesus, a quote from Isaiah, and boom, here we go. We're getting started. And so it's a quick introduction. He doesn't do the genealogy, the birth narrative, none of that. He starts with John the Baptist, and we have Jesus's baptism, and then we have the temptations. And we talked about his baptism and temptations during the Matthew class, so I'm not going to go back into that. If you're curious about that and interpretations and how to read that, or one way to read that is those stories, you can go back and check out the Matthew class, and it's in there. So then we have the Galilean ministry, which is the biggest bulk of this gospel. And it's where Jesus called the first disciples. That was one of the first things he did, was he called some disciples. A major portion of Jesus's ministry actually occurred in Galilee. And one thing you'll notice about Mark and his gospel is that he doesn't have the big Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain like Matthew and Luke, respectively. He doesn't just put Jesus in these diatribes, like as when we outlined Matthew, we had those specific sections of the discourses where we had these long sayings of Jesus, and Mark doesn't really structure his gospel in that way. As Jesus ministered, he revealed himself as one in authority and had power over evil, illness, nature, and death itself. And as you read through this, and I hope you will read these sections in the way that I've laid it out, and I think it'll help make a lot of sense of the gospel. We don't have time really to do that in this version of the class. But you'll see throughout the ministry in Galilee that Jesus shows his authority over each of these things. And then many thought Jesus wasn't the Messiah because he contaminated himself with sinners. So you guys will remember that, he hung out with tax collectors and prostitutes, and he had them over, or he ate at their houses. And he even had Matthew, who was a tax collector, as one of his disciples. One of his closest friends was a tax collector. So they thought this guy can't be the Messiah because he's dirty. The Galilean ministry. So Jesus established himself as having authority over the Sabbath as well as the illness and the evil. He even says, I am the Lord over the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, not man. Is that right? The Sabbath, you know what I'm trying to say. Forces of evil recognized Jesus. They fell down before him. People, though, struggled to recognize who he was, including the disciples. For example, in Mark, I believe it's chapter 4, there's the part where they go out to sea, and they're in the boat, and there's this big storm, and Jesus is just asleep in the stern, just, getting some rest, and the disciples, wake him up and say, don't you care that we're perishing? And Jesus is like, oh, come on. Wakes up, kind of says, peace, be still, to the sea, and everything was calmed down. And so it showed he had authority over nature as well. And the disciples questioned each other when Jesus did this and calmed the sea. They said, who is this guy that even the wind and the waves obey him? So we see people struggling, including those absolutely closest to him and the ones that spent the most time with him, struggling to figure out who exactly this guy was, because he didn't fit the picture. Just like I said in the Matthew class, they wanted a conqueror. These people wanted a king. They wanted someone to come in and take over the Roman government, overthrow them, and then be their leader in a political sense. And that was not the way God had intended Jesus' life, death, and resurrection to go. And so people were genuinely confused because he showed these signs of being the Messiah, but he wasn't being the Messiah like they needed him to be the Messiah that they wanted him to be, really. They needed him to be the way he was, but they didn't understand it. And chapter 5, 1 through 20, demonstrates what Jesus was about. He was, and I love this, he was there to restore people to wholeness in right relationship to God and one another. And boy, isn't that the mission of all churches and all Christians, is our mission in life. It's even in the catechism, and in a similar version to this in the Book of Common Prayer. Our job is to restore people to wholeness in right relationship to God and one another. The Catechism just uses the word harmony, to restore harmony and right relationship to God and to one another. That sums up the Christian mission. The journey towards Jerusalem. So here we have just a real quick breakdown of chapter 10. And feel free to read this, please. And if you look, the teaching about divorce and Jesus and the children, Jesus is taking the norms of society and saying, not really. He's raising women up to not an equal level necessarily, but definitely above a slave or property level with his teaching about divorce. And then he's raising children up to something beyond what they were called back then, which was really just, slave labor a lot of the time. He's engaging these folks in a better life by talking about them in these two. And then we have the rich young man who we think is a super moralistic guy and a really good guy, and he follows the commandments. And Jesus says, "No, you're not doing it right. You gotta restart. You gotta sell everything you own, and then try again." And then we have Jesus predicting his death, and then he talks about the importance of service, and Bartimaeus is healed. So this is during the journey towards Jerusalem. And then we have the week of suffering. So prior to his arrest and trial, Jesus received affirmation and resistance, and we need to keep this in mind when we're celebrating Holy Week every year. And I think we do a pretty good job of that, because on Palm Sunday, everyone's saying, "Hosanna in the highest! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So Hosanna means saves. So people are thinking this guy's going to march triumphantly into Jerusalem, and somehow, even though we've never seen him speak of any violence, we've never seen him do anything violent, somehow they perhaps thought he was going to save them in the way they assumed that was going to happen. And then he also got resistance. He was intent on confronting the religious leadership. When you read this section, you'll notice that he's coming up against the Pharisees. I mean, they're obviously instigating some of it or most of it, but Jesus isn't backing down. He's trying to help the Pharisees see and help others see where they've gone wrong and the corruption and the misinterpretation of the law. And so that's a big part of it, and that was a lot of the resistance he was facing. Chapter 13 is really interesting. It's called the Little Apocalypse by some, because Jesus discusses the end of the age, and no one knows the hour and the time. And it's funny, in Dr. Blair's book, he talks about how some people try to read things into these books and try to figure out the day and the time. But really, if even Jesus didn't know the day or the time, we don't have any hope of knowing ourselves. All we can do is be ready, which is what Jesus charges us to do. He tells us, be ready. You don't know the day or the hour. I don't know the day or the hour, so just be ready. And then Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, and it was the new meal of the new covenant. So in the old covenant that they had with God, the Jews had with God, they had the Passover meal. And so Jesus is instituting the new meal of the new covenant. And the new covenant is God's love. Love one another, love me, love your neighbor. It's back to that right relationship. Restoration, harmony, God, and with other people. And here's a quote that I absolutely love. This is after Jesus' death, resurrection. Dr. Blair puts this at the end of this chapter on Mark. By putting the Messiah's suffering in perspective, Mark helped his readers to put their own suffering and anticipated suffering into perspective. Jesus stayed true to his mission, although he was alone and all his friends had deserted him at the crucifixion. And by Christ's example and presence in their lives, Mark's readers could know that remaining faithful under the stress of rejection and persecution would lead to victory. And part of what is important here is that I said Mark was writing to a Roman audience, and the likelihood is that the people that were reading this were suffering persecution under Nero, They had probably lost the temple, which was destroyed in 70 A.D. And so they're reading this Jewish, the Roman audience near the Jewish people, as it were, are reading this. They're under persecution. The Christians are being persecuted. They're being crucified. They're being flayed. I mean, they're being killed in really creative ways by the Roman government. That was one thing the Romans were very good at, was figuring out how to kill people. And so they're being persecuted. So this whole gospel points to, yeah, there's going to be stress, there's going to be rejection, there's going to be persecution, but in the end, Jesus rose again, and so will you. And that's how the gospel ends. And so, thank you for joining me. If you have any thoughts or questions, please feel free to email me at sburnham@stgeorgechurch.org. I really appreciate you watching, and I'm enjoying getting the emails from you all and the questions and the discussions. And just so you know, after I'm done with the Gospel of John, we're going to set up a Zoom for everyone that's been taking part in these lessons, so we can all kind of get together and just chat about what we've learned so far. And I'm really excited to do that. So there will be an email sent in the next couple of weeks about that. Anyway, thank you again. I will see you next week when I bring you Luke. Bye.